Hello, everyone. We're going to start in a minute. We're just waiting for all the participants to come into the room. Okay, shall we start? All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Political Champions of Basic Income in Dialogue session. My name is Sheila Reguer. I am the chair of the Basic Income Canada Network and on the organizing team for this NABIG. This is the fourth keynote session of this 19th annual NABIG Congress. Couple of housekeeping things. If you are joining us from Facebook or Crowdcast, please register at the website to gain access to over 40 hours of programming. Now, a fair bit of the programming has taken place, but you can get access to that to watch it afterwards. The website link is posted in the chat, I believe. I would also like to suggest many of the sessions, we've had some really lively chats in the chat feature of Zoom. If you want to ask a question, however, it's best to put it in the Q&A section rather than the chat. And one of our wonderful people in the background will be monitoring that chat for questions. So I want to start this session by just reminding everybody that our Congress began with a session on Thursday with a number of United States mayors talking about their initiative for basic income. And I was really impressed by one of the things that the mayor of Stockton said with regard to politics, that cities are the party, not of federal parties, but they are the party of get shit done. And I thought that was brilliant. But they all agreed at this panel that what was really needed was federal policy action in order to make a basic income a reality and to make it permanent. So that's where this panel is going. We're now the panel of the people who have the power in federal government and the advocates moving federal politicians to act on this panel. So we have both Canadians and Americans. The Canadians are actually government people, and most of the Americans are people on the outside who are the ones pushing everything along. So I'll start with Julie Zurowitz. She is the first female member of Partford Davenport. That's a riding in sort of central Toronto, so big city. She is a liberal, which means she's with the governing party, although we have a minority government situation now that Americans won't understand, so we'll leave that alone. Julie was recently appointed to the influential Standing Committee on Finance. She serves as chair of the National Immigration and Refugee Caucus, vice chair of the Canadian section of PARO Americas, chair of the Canada-Turkey Parliamentary Group, co-chair of the Canada-Mexico Parliamentary Friendship Group. So we've got another North American connection there, and vice chair of the NATO Parliamentary Association. Welcome, Julie. We also have Leah Gazan. She is the MP for Winnipeg Centre, a very different riding. She's currently the New Democratic Party's critic for children, families, and social development, as well as deputy critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship. Leah has been a champion in the fight for a permanent, guaranteed, livable basic income in Canada, and earlier this year was named to Maclean's 2021 Power List. Again, for our American colleagues, Maclean's is, I don't know, like Time magazine or something for Canadians. She was a prominent Winnipeg lead during Idle No More and co-founded the We Care campaign aimed at building public will to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. She's a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation located in Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. And hi, Kim. Hi, Leah. I'm moving to Kim now. I'm watching my screen. The Honorable Kim Pate is in our other house on Parliament Hill. She is an independent senator, currently in her car. She was appointed to the Senate on November 10th, 2016. First and foremost, she is the mother of Michael and Madison. She's also nationally a renowned advocate who has spent nearly 40 years working in and around the legal and penal systems of Canada with and on behalf of some of the most marginalized, victimized, criminalized, and institutionalized, particularly imprisoned youth, men, and women. And now for the American part of our North American group, I'll introduce Liam de Clive Lowe. He serves as Executive Director at Humanity Forward. In this role, he's building a fully bipartisan advocacy operation to accelerate the passage of direct cash relief policies, to advance basic income, and to eradicate poverty in America. Prior to this role, he served as an advisor, staffer, and manager on numerous presidential and Senate campaigns in every region of the country. Welcome, Liam. Next is Giselle Huff, who I had the sort of pleasure of kind of meeting in Kumo space the other evening. Hi, Giselle. She's president of the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity. The loss of her son Gerald to pancreatic cancer in 2018 spurred Dr. Huff to apply her talents and energy to a cause they both shared, concern about technological unemployment, the growing economic divide, and the potential of UBI to help address these challenges on a broad scale. Dr. Huff served as San Francisco University High School's Director of Development for 12 years and is the Executive Director for the Jacqueline Hume Foundation for over 20 years, where her return on investment for launching blended learning was paramount. Finally, our fearless leader for NABIG this year, Stacey Rutland. Stacey is the founder of Income Movement with degrees in English literature, history, and education. She's the first landed, education. She first landed in the classroom, then to user experience, research, and design, and finally Income Movement. Her passion for economics and background in technology led Stacey to the basic income community, where she began to understand the larger basic income ecosystem. That's a really interesting way of putting it too, I think. She subsequently founded Income Movement, an organization advocating for economic justice through fostering highly collaborative coalitions and building a grassroots movement. So welcome everybody. I don't know what order we're going to take the questions in. If people want to jump in and mix it up rather than me pointing, we'll see how that goes. So we have a good amount of time to cover a number of issues. I have 3 basic questions. The second one is going to deal with challenges and some of the tough stuff we're facing. But I want to start on a more positive note. And that's the more hopeful side of what you see in your work. So we're in a context where basic income movements are growing everywhere. That's obvious. COVID has changed the way we look at things. Election cycles have changed the way we look at things. In other panels, we've talked about how stimulus and emergency checks have changed the way we see things. So you are all in different capacities involved in building support and building coalitions among politicians. We'll deal with the challenges later, as I said, but let's start with what's working, what opportunities you see, what convinces your own colleagues, what convinces other politicians, how have you influenced them, what else influences them and has brought them on board. Is there anybody who'd like to jump in and start, or shall I point fingers? Okay, Julie. You just have, good.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. It's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and hello to all the panelists. Now, Sheila, I don't think in the introduction, did you mention that I had introduced a private member's bill, Bill 273 in the House? Is that common knowledge to everyone?
You didn't put that in the text you sent us.
So okay, that's a fundamental thing for people to know. So I have introduced the first piece of legislation in the House of Commons in Canada, an act to create a national basic income strategy. So we're right now at second reading, although the House is about to rise. So I don't think we're going to get any more progress in this term, and we'd have to come back this fall to be able to do so. So I want to make sure that people had that information before we we forgot going. In terms of what I think is working, you said a little bit about, the time has really made us think a little bit. So I think we're all coming out of COVID and we are all wondering what kind of world we want to live in and what world we want to come back to. And I actually think that context and what we've lived in is actually, to me, is going to put people, I think, in the right space to be looking at some of these, looking at ideas that before have been seen as radical, but I think now are starting to see as, I think this is something we should really consider. In Canada, I think what's working is I think we're seeing support from multiple parties. So I did second reading earlier this week on Monday, and so you saw support from the NDP, you saw support from Bloc Québécois, you saw support at least from at least one other colleague from my party, but there's actually quite a bit of support within my party. There's also strong and growing support from Canadians. Sheila, you lead a great group here in Canada, but I would say that we have leadership from maybe whether it's 10 or 20 organizations that are helping to educate and helping to sort of grow the support for basic income across our country. And there's growing global interest. It's really great for me to be able to use the Stockton example, talk about what would happen in Japan or Finland or Korea, the 3-day conference that they were going on. So there is a growing global interest. So to me, that's what's working. And I think that going back to my initial point, because we're starting to think, what kind of world do we want to come back to? I think people are starting to say, I think we need to start relooking at the systems we have in place and whether it's the right types of systems and supports that we need in order to meet the challenges of the 21st centuries and to succeed.
Thank you so much. I am going to take prerogative, I think, now and ask Liam if he wants to tell us a little bit more about what's happening federally in the United States.
Sure, I'd be more than happy to. Thank you so much, Sheila, and thank you, Stacy, and everyone for organizing this and for having me. It is a real treat. To your question, Sheila, I think that this is there has never been a better time for an idea as good as this, at least in American politics, in the last 50 years. And the dynamics within both political parties are such that there's an openness to new ideas. And it's frankly very motivating to work on. And I think I would hope that our friends here to the North feel the same way, but I can at least speak for the States in saying that it's a very motivating time to work on something because it's not the case that there is so much momentum naturally that any of us would feel confident saying this is going to happen, right? And at the same time, it's also not something where it feels futile, right? It's in that intermediate zone where action makes a difference. And so if I would leave anyone who's listening to this or watching this with one message, it is that this is the time when action makes a difference. And so right now, you're seeing a dynamic where I'll just speak to both sides because we're very focused as you mentioned, Sheila, our organization, Humanity Forward, is very focused on being a bipartisan organization because we want to make sure that the cause of eradicating poverty in the United States, which is long overdue, doesn't crash and burn as the control of Congress and control of the White House naturally swings back and forth in the years ahead. And what we're seeing right now is in the Democratic Party, there is starting to become a real embrace of the idea of moving away from some of the more traditional 90s era targeted, quote unquote, targeted programs that are trying to solve a discrete problem with a very unique program, and instead moving in the direction of just putting resources directly in people's hands so they can make their own decisions and free themselves up to find work, pursue their dreams, lift themselves out of a bad situation, et cetera. And on the Republican side, we're seeing a lot of the same thing, where there's a recognition of the fact that the stimulus payments that we and some of the income movement, others here worked on, really played an instrumental role in addressing some things that Republicans are talking about all the time, right? Addressing how do we help revive business and small businesses, right? Where did the spending from the stimulus payments go? Right into small businesses' pockets and into their customers who are spending it at their businesses. And then if you're on a more philosophical level, if you believe, as many Republican voters do, and some Republican elected officials do, that it's much more efficient to put resources directly in people's hands as opposed to trying to decide from the federal government level what people need. It's really something that's very naturally at home there as well. And so all we're trying to do is just meet that interest and meet that need with information and education and helpful coalition building. And we're finding that we're getting a lot of receptivity. So it's a very, very positive time for all of us.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to ask Leah now, because we've heard about Julie's motion or Julie's bill. So one of the things that I think is really important about what you have done, Leah, is build a lot of support from people who are a little bit reluctant in this area. So if you can talk a little bit about like what worked, whether they're strong arm tactics or some gentler things.
Thanks so much for the question, Sheila. And I think it was a combination of both. But before I get started on that, I just want to point out that, keeping people poor is a political choice. We have enough resources, certainly in Canada and the States, to ensure that everybody lives with human rights and dignity. Government after government willfully chooses to keep people poor. And we know in terms of, my case, one of the things that I put forward as a case for basic income is to discuss the high cost of poverty. I'll give you an example. It costs $115,000 to keep one person incarcerated a year. We know there's a direct correlation between poverty and crime. When you look after people, it saves money. There's been numerous research studies that have been done in Canada, including things like it's called the Dolphin study, where they found that a guaranteed income had immediate results, including people's mental health was better. There was savings on healthcare costs. There was a higher graduation rate. So we know there's been so much research done on this. We know guaranteed incomes work. How did I get things going? Well, I don't think it really was me. I put forward a motion in conjunction with Guaranteed Income Manitoba and Guaranteed Basic Income Canada. I worked side by side, drafting a motion, and I call it the People's Motion. I think that any sort of movement building, if you want success in movement building, something that I have been doing throughout my life in terms of, participating in movements, trying to build movements, it has to start with people. Our social safety net does not work in Canada at all, and most benefits are dependent on work. And we know that not everybody is able to work. For example, people with very severe mental health and trauma are not able to work. We have old age security for seniors in Canada. It's not livable. Students, as a longtime academic, one of the main reasons why students would drop out of university is because of poverty, issues of housing. So I say that because guaranteed income is not a silver bullet. And I think that's some of the really clear key messages that have come out of guaranteed income movements in Canada. That the motion that I put forward was a guaranteed income, basic income, livable income, in addition to current and future government programs and supports. I'll give you an example. Disabled people. We know that if you put in place a guaranteed income and then you cut all their programs, it might place disabled people in greater levels of poverty. Programs, for example, guaranteed livable basic income, and not looking at, investments in affordable, accessible social housing. Again, could wind up leaving people in greater levels of poverty. In Canada, we had a national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and they saw a direct correlation between rates and violence and women going murdered and missing and housing and poverty. So, it needs to be part of a package of programs for people to ensure that people have the help and support they need. So, when I'm asked, how how did you, I had like 40,000 people, over 40,000 people on a petition. I just put out a survey the other day. We had like 3,000 responses in like a couple of hours. Where do we go next with basic income? I think a big part of it is exactly what you're doing, building from the bottom up instead of the top down, and lifting up voices on the ground and pushing that movement forward. I think people like Kim, I ran a motion. Kim's been working on this initiative for many years. I know Julie's recently put forward a bill. As people understand it better, people are more engaged. Sorry, I was about to sneeze. So I think, the education, making it fun, ensuring you lift up people's voices, and really putting forward a program that works. I say that, and just as a last comment, I put forward motion 46. It was very specific. It's not just having a guaranteed income, it's the kind of guaranteed income that's put forward that will either make it a good program or something that will get our social safety net even further. So I think there is a growing awareness of that. That's certainly been a focus of the Motion 46 campaign. And so I say nothing less than 46.
Thank you very much, Leah. I'm going to turn to Giselle now, I think, because they're amongst the real differences between Canada and the United States, I think. We've got these political champions now. We don't have the kind of, I don't know, funding and organization and different kinds of ways in which movements are supported are quite different in the States than they are here. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work, Giselle.
So I'm very awed by being included in this August panel. I guess I'm here to speak to the power of one and of what you can do, in a very small space. I'm just going to tell you the story of how I was instrumental in getting the county of Santa Clara, which is the Silicon Valley County in California, very affluent county. How I got the county to start a UBI pilot for transitioning foster youth. So at the time, Supervisor Dave Cortese and I had lunch in a very nice restaurant in San Francisco in July of 2019. And he had some awareness of UBI, not an expert by any means, but he knew what the concept was. And we started talking about what could Santa Clara, which thinks of itself as a very innovative district, do in that space. And I mentioned, that transitioning foster youth are people who are really left completely bereft when they, age out of the system, and they're not prepared by the system actually to fit into real life. So on the basis of that conversation, and not only do I give Dave credit for getting it through his political, the board of supervisors, but he unfailingly gives me credit for this based on this one conversation I had with him, which I've never seen in any politician do, especially when my contribution was really quite small. The Fund for Humanity just paid for a research paper that enabled the staff of Santa Clara County to move ahead faster in putting together the plan because they didn't have to do the research. And, in a bureaucracy like that, the staff has many other things to do, not just one thing. So by just making that available, a very small investment, as Sheila was saying earlier when she introduced me, in my real world experience, the 22 years I spent in the foundation world, I was known as the queen of ROI. No one could believe what I could do with much less money than Gates Foundation and the Walton Foundation and all the big players in that space. So anyway, Dave was able to, so we met in July of 19. I testified in December of 19. And in May of 20, with the pandemic giving more impetus to this pilot, the Board of Supervisors approved it unanimously, and that comes out of their budget. This is not privately funded. This is funded by the county, which made it, at this point in time, very unusual. Now, the payoff of this story is that Dave Cortese is now in the Senate, the California Senate, and he is just pushing through a bill to make this program available to all transitioning foster youth in California. So from a very small start, with very little power no power to speak of, you know, this particular pilot and this idea of helping this particular cohort of young people has taken root.
Terrific. Excuse me. Okay, since I've been going Canadian American, I'm going to continue with this, even though I know what I want to ask Stacey now. So Kim, do you want to talk about some of the coalition building and like really important things that have happened just generally in the work that you're doing, but particularly in the Senate?
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you. I'm very pleased to join you from the traditional unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I'm on the shores of the Kitchissippi River right now on the Quebec side. And I am very pleased to also join you on Juneteenth. It's not lost on me that the issues we're talking about really impact those who are racialized, those who have grown up and lived in poverty, those who are challenged with past trauma, those who are challenged with disabilities. And so my whole reason for when I was asked whether my name could be put forward for the Senate of Canada, my whole reason hinged on those very issues. I had worked for 40 years with people, as Sheila's already mentioned, who were many of them in prison. And so walking backwards, it was very clear what contributed, as Leah and Julie and others have already said, to who ends up in prison. It's not those who cause the greatest harm, it's those who every other system generally leaves behind. And so guaranteed livable income was a big focus, as well as pharmacare, dental care, mental health care, free post-secondary education, all of the things that we know create a more substantively equal society and provide greater opportunities for people to not only survive, but thrive and contribute to communities. And we know it increases the standard of living for everybody, lowers crime rates, lowers the cost of healthcare systems, criminal legal systems, and the like. So that was my impetus for coming to the Senate. Just before the pandemic hit, in the interest of trying to have the Senate take an active role and a constructive leadership role, I announced that in February of 2020 that I wanted us to conduct a study looking at where we were 50 years after another study had been done by the Senate, the Kroll report, a special Senate report on poverty in Canada, where they called for a guaranteed livable income, and where also the Status of Women Commission for the country had also called for basic income. So as Leah has already mentioned, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry, which concluded 2 years ago in this country, also called for a guaranteed livable income. And the National Action Plan announced by the Liberal government week before last says that they are going to act on this. So in the end, when COVID hit, it looked like we were prophetic. In fact, this was what my life's work was planning to be in the Senate. And so 50 senators signed on and said the emergency benefits that the Canadian government put in place to assist those who had lost work, not necessarily everybody in poverty, should be pivoted, and that we should actually pivot to a guaranteed livable income, and that we had the opportunity to do so, as we had seen by the ability to roll out monies during this pandemic. It was interesting that the government has not chosen to do that yet, but as you can hear, we have amazing advocates in the form of Julie, in the form of Leah, in the form of Sheila and all of the folks in the community who have been doing this work. And I was also inspired by senators who have gone before me. Some of you will very well know Hugh Segal, who inspired me and mentored me in this area, Art Eggleton, who is former mayor of Toronto as well as a senator. And all of that inspired us to do this. And I agree absolutely with what Leah said. These are policy decisions, and they are policy decisions that we could take during this pandemic in this country, a wealthy, wealthy country. We have left behind still millions, anywhere between 3 and 5 million people who have had no support because of the moralistic, in my humble opinion, judgment, because they weren't working, somehow they didn't deserve assistance. People who were taking care of children, who were taking care of the elderly, taking care of people with disabilities, taking care of themselves because they were in precarious employment and couldn't work. Many people were not entitled to the benefits that have been rolled out. And so many of us continue the work, and I'm very hopeful that we're in a moment, particularly with the National Action Plan, but also because we have 2 provinces like your states in the United States, Prince Edward Island and Yukon, that have already signaled to the federal government they want to start implementation, not more pilots. We've had the pilot that was mentioned in Manitoba. We've had a pilot that you've undoubtedly heard about because I know there were presentations in Ontario. No more pilots. We need to, if we're going to pilot anything, it's pilot implementation. And much the way that Medicare rolled out in Canada, it was started in one province in Saskatchewan. This could roll out starting in one province or territory. And I have no doubt that once people see the benefits of it, every province and territory will want to sign on. And it is something that, again, as others have already said, and all of you know who are involved in this, not only does it essentially pay for itself, it costs less to keep people engaged in their community, housed, clothed, fed, and educated than it does to keep them steeped in poverty on the street, having to use emergency beds, emergency shelter, emergency health care, and ending up in the only system that can't say no, which is our criminal legal system, which is why we have massive, and again, coming back to the fact that it's Juneteenth, and in 2 days, we're going to be focusing on Indigenous heritage in this country, that it is predominantly racialized people. 44% of women in prison in this country in the federal system are Indigenous, 10% are of African heritage. That means that is not who is posing the greatest risk. And increasingly it's people with disabling mental health issues because of past trauma and the intersections of addictions. So the system that cannot say no is becoming more and more burgeoned by those who are on the margins. So the opportunities are, I think, rife, and it's the time for us to really challenge. We're about to supposedly head into an election, a federal election. And many of us, it's why I'm on TikTok. Whoever thought a dinosaur like me would be on TikTok? But it's my daughter and other contemporaries, young people in our office, who are saying you have to get out there because we want the election to really rise and fall on who has been left behind during this pandemic. And I think it's a great opportunity. And I look forward to actually, I hope Canada will lead internationally in implementing this across the country.
Great, thanks, Kim. So Stacey, I'm going to turn it over to you now. I mean, I think everybody's talked about how big this problem is and how big the challenge is. And Giselle and others have hinted at like the importance of research, of grassroots movements, of like coordinating all of us together who are doing this. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think when I was first founding Income Movement, I did a lot of, had a lot of conversations with organizations that are within the basic income community here in the United States, and also just did a lot of looking back at how significant systematic change has happened, what movement building has looked like in the past, and then having conversations with others in the basic income community here in the United States. It was very clear that that the grassroots side of things was absolutely critical, and that an organization that was focusing on that, as well as the coordination and kind of collaboration across the movement, across these kind of pillars of, thought leadership, policy, and grassroots advocacy was really critical. So a lot of what we do at Income Movement is twofold. We offer opportunities for advocates all across the country to be able to engage in advocacy, growing education across their community, helping people understand more about what this is, dig in a little bit deeper, and to tailor those kinds of actions and engagement opportunities to the specific people in their community. So really making sure that we know that not one size kind of cookie cutter argument or conversation or type of event does not work in all situations. And so building that framework for people who are already passionate about this to have the tools to go out and have that deep engagement with their community is critical. We know from a lot of the research that's come out of different campaigns over the last few election cycles that deep canvassing, the personal, interpersonal, real kind of conversations are where the greatest leaps actually happen. And so we want to make sure that that is fully supported as we are doing this work kind of for building a larger movement. At the same time, collaboration is so critical, and it's come up over and over in the conversations we've had during this conference. I think last night, as we were diving deeper into the data that's been coming out of pilots, Evelyn Forget at a certain point just said, listen, I'm not sure that more data and pilots is necessarily going to move the needle. We've done a lot of that, and it hasn't gotten us as far as we hoped. There has to be community building around this. There has to be a demand on the ground so that people who are running, people are either already sitting in office or are going to be running, know that a vote may be on the line if they don't step forward and take a firm positive stance towards a guaranteed income. So this is a really important component here. Income Movement does not actually work in the policy space at all. We think it's very important to have grassroots and policy a little bit separate from a strategy perspective. The needs of the people may be very different than what has to happen on the Hill to get policy passed, right? But we know that if it's led by the people, if the people demand that, then we're going to have a better chance of actually having the kind of policy that we want passed when it comes time to have Congress sit down and hash it out across the table. So it is absolutely, I think, critical, and it's been really exciting and wonderful here in this conversation, just even in this group of people, but also just across all of the conversations that have been part of the last 3 days, that this need for collaboration, this need for coordinating across all of these different parts of our movement is really critical, and that we really are poised at this moment to make huge leaps with that coordination, because the moment is so ripe, as everybody's been pointing out. So yeah, really, really excited about where we've come just in the last 12 months, but incredibly excited about where I think we can go, certainly in the United States over the next 12 to 18 months.
Super. And I find everything you say exciting because you just give energy, all of you. It's amazing. During one of the panel discussions this morning on universality, there was a really interesting conversation that came up around how important country and political context is to what people are doing. And the issue of what you can sell politically. So one of our panelists, people didn't necessarily know that, but she has been a candidate. She will be a candidate in the next election. And she said, like, there are certain things that you just can't say to people on their doorstep because they're not going to buy it. So the second question then is more around those kind of challenges that you face when you're talking to people. And I'm going to put out a sort of list, but I imagine that there are similarities, but also differences in country context. Just looking at these really I don't know, it's been described to me as sacred cows. In other contexts, people have described them as zombie arguments that just won't go away. Things like that. I mentioned in particular, perhaps, Leah wrote an article recently taking on privilege amongst people who are quote unquote progressive. The first comment that came back on that article displayed like a lot of the fear and anxiety and ugliness that exists out there. It was really quite astounding. So, I mean, there's an issue like that. And Julie, I know you've been trying to get across the idea to a lot of people that this is not just about poverty, which is another one of those issues that doesn't always sell well when you're looking at trying to get a lot of support for an idea that you need. So I'm sure that all of you get versions of, and there may be other things on this list, but this is my list of the sacred cows and zombie arguments. So we don't want checks for billionaires. This comes up in Canada, Canadian politicians a lot. Julie's smiling. People won't work. And this one has like really deep psychological and historical barriers that you've all alluded to in different ways. It costs too much. The devil is in the details, meaning we will never get to a point where we can agree on something. So that's what the opponents come up with all the time. You know, it's just too complicated. And then the last one on my list is it's too radical. Like it's better to just kind of tinker around the edges with what we've got. You know, we must be able to make this better somehow. So how do you address these? Like, how do you overcome them? How do you talk to people about these kinds of things? And you might not all want to talk about all of them, but, you know, like pick your favorite zombie or something. Is there a volunteer to start this? So we should start with Americans this time. Oh, well, Leah's volunteered. Go for it, Leah.
So, you know, prior to deciding to put myself forward to become a member of parliament and probably the most elitist colonial monsters anyone could ever find themselves, particularly as an Indigenous person. I think education is powerful. I've used a lot of the, arguments and provided counter arguments. And I think truth is really powerful. I think, Senator Pate Kim, alluded to it. This country, I'm talking on a Canadian context, was built on the wrongful and violent dispossession of lands of Indigenous peoples that left us poor and sometimes even homeless on our own lands. That's the truth. That is the truth. And the same sort of behavior occurs today. I'll give you a couple of examples. They have spent in Canada $18 billion for TMX pipeline. I'm fighting to keep people alive in my community right now, many whom are dealing with, as Kim spoke about, severe mental health and trauma as a result of violent and ongoing colonization in this country. And I think, if you look even prior to the pandemic, people are getting more educated about the history of this country. I think that is very key. But even prior to that, big oil companies have never had the back of workers. So it's not surprising to me that even prior to the pandemic, 60% of Albertans actually supported a guaranteed livable basic income. We see, certainly in Canada, the rich getting richer. We've seen even during the pandemic, the first bailout was to big oil, and people are tired of it. There is no reason why anybody in this country, I'm talking about Canada, should not have a home and have what they need to live in dignity. This is our charter. And when you frame a guaranteed income around human rights, I don't know even many Canadians, if you say this is a human rights matter. Poverty is a violent human rights violation. People are like, yeah, I never thought about it that way. When you talk about, people being lazy and not working, my counter argument is I say, Is that really the problem? Why don't we start saying, you know, that ultra rich owner of a corporation, you know, drinking cocktails on their yacht on my taxpayer dollars? Like, maybe we need to reframe the discussion. And so when I wrote that article recently, you know, trying to give a different perspective to the arguments coming from the left, I was calling out that privilege and the fact that most of the people that make decisions about policy and law in this country come from privilege. You know, and this whole discussion around incremental justice usually comes from people who have human rights. And so I think these things, we need to name it. I've had a really positive response. I don't, you know, I push this forward in a very direct way. You know, I'm a longtime educator. I never was known for beating around the bush on many things. And the response has been pretty good. I don't get a lot of pushback. Sure, there's going to be people that argue, and usually it comes from people who don't even believe we should have a social safety net. So, you know, I think there's always going to be naysayers, but I think that what the thing to focus on is that people who are in support of a guaranteed livable basic income grow all the time. So I'll leave it at that. I get really annoyed by the arguments. I'm sorry, Sheila. I've you know, I started at this campaign and then I tried to crush it with the article, and we'll just keep pushing things forward.
Okay, I saw Liam and Stacy nodding very vigorously. Which one of you would like to jump in now?
Can I just say one thing to Leah? I know because you're based in Canada, I understand why you qualified so many of your remarks about being about the country of Canada, but almost everything you said, I think, is absolutely appropriate and applicable to the United States as well, whether it's how our country was founded or the kind of frustration of what is happening with the rich getting richer, and a complete lack of kind of fair paying into a system to help really make sure that the most marginalized have at least some level of kind of floor to stand on, so that their most basic rights are addressed. So I just wanted to say, like, I think everything that you said, there's not very much difference, I think, in a lot of those fundamental pieces across our countries, and I think we see it consistently. I think the arguments and the feelings around that may be culturally across our different countries may be a little bit different, because we have such a different relationship with the idea of capitalism and socialism and what the role of the government is and things like that. So I think some of what might be in the more kind of extreme side of things politically in Canada, it might be a little bit more mainstream in the United States, as far as the number of people that we need to try to help move their thinking forward. And I think here, you know, one of the things that you mentioned, one of the zombies at the beginning of this question, Sheila, around people won't work and laziness and the deep ingrainedness of that in the United States is in many ways like the largest hill to climb, I think. And one of the things that we've found that has been so important about what's happened during COVID is that really there's been a shift in understanding around, I mean, one, I think more people have lost jobs due to no part on anything that they did wrong. And so there's been a little bit of an awakening, or certainly a more mobilized group of people who have previously been privileged to be able to speak up and say, like, the system isn't working, it's not protecting us or helping us in these most dire moments. And that's kind of the role that government should have. But it also shined a real light on families and care, and thinking about work in different ways, and thinking about how our society is actually structured in that side of things. Having schools closed for as long as we have in the United States, and the data that's come out of the impact of that on women and mothers. In December, all 120,000 people who left the workplace were all women, statistically 100%, because they were there taking care of kids. And we can see also that a lot of the data that was coming out related to stimulus checks was really talking a lot about how many children were raised out of poverty with those checks, and those moments or those data points have really been a foundation for legislation that has come out this year. I think the recognition and the willingness and openness across party lines, and Liam can speak to this because this is like his world, but you know, we saw the passage of the expanded child tax credit here in the United States, which is the closest thing to a guaranteed income for families that we've ever seen. It's going to be implemented monthly starting July 15th. It's incredibly exciting. But, you know, Mitt Romney on the Republican side proposed something fairly similar. You know, the need and recognition of to protect and help kids is a important moment or kind of realization that you can't blame kids for being lazy. You can't blame kids for, like, you know, they're just going to use that money, you know, to drink alcohol. All the stereotypes go away. And so you actually get down to the heart of the human rights side of this, of building empathy, deep empathy for the people who are struggling in poverty right now and the impact of that. And so I think that it feels like one of the areas where we've seen some real shifting happen, because people have a little bit more understanding of, you know what, even if you're not actually physically working, you're probably doing some kind of work if you're a parent, and it's really important and highly valued work. You know, we can't just slice all of this the same way and say, oh, if you're not working, it's because you're lazy. It's way more complex than that. And that's given us opportunities for people who want to pass legislation for direct cash to get that through.
Super. Who would like Julie? And then
thanks so much. Fascinating conversation. So one of the things I want to sort of say, one of the key reasons, and I probably should have begun with this, one of the key reasons I'm such a huge supporter of a guaranteed basic income is the government I'm part of. So we're part of the governing party. This is my second term. Both times we were the governing party. Since we were elected, we tried desperately to tackle income inequality and poverty. And there's any number of measures that we've taken: increasing taxes on the top 1%, reduce it on the middle class, increase the, create a Canada Child Benefit, give a lot more money to, families who have children, increase money, GIS, Guaranteed Income Supplement, more money for seniors, more money for workers who are at the lowest end of the income scale. But while we did have a positive impact on improving poverty, reducing poverty, I would say to you, the income inequality continues to grow. And so that was very stark for me to see that. And then the same people, many of the same people that couldn't access a lot of our programs, still couldn't access our programs, even with all the things we were desperately trying to do. Then through COVID, I started seeing the systems and how we were very generous in terms of our supports, but our systems were not agile and they were not flexible. And then it made me realize, oh my gosh, our systems were created in the 1940s, adjusted in the 1970s, Band-Aid all through the last 40, 50 years. And then we still think it's supposed to be able to be capable to help us address the issues of the 21st century. Well, it's not. Particularly now that we have the world of work changing, the advent of AI and automation taking our blue and white collar jobs, and also all these disruptions from COVID and climate change being there. And then also, I think are all realizing, and I think it's come out in different ways, that the current models, economics models that we have not resulted in a more fair or equitable world. So I think we're all asking us, that's kind of where we're at, and that's kind of what's been behind my thinking. I want to address the people won't work in the cost item. One of the things about people won't work, first of all, I think that there's just too many examples, and I think Stockton is one of them as an example where it's actually not true that it has actually stopped people from working. So there's tons of examples around the world where that's actually simply not true. Also, no one should look at basic income as a get-rich scheme. This is going to make anyone rich. So whenever someone says, this is, check for billionaires, I'm like, well, taxes, how we sort of design the system is going to ensure that no one sort of above, no billionaire should be able to sort of have access. But it's not a get-rich scheme. To me, it's not just about reducing poverty, but it's also against protecting someone from going into poverty, and also providing enough stability so that people can have the stability they need so that they can make decisions to become their best selves. I also, and this is maybe part of the conversation, some of the reading I've been doing, there's also a reality around human fragility. We talk about poverty, we talk about illness. Who knows what's going to happen? Some people have mental illness, some people have illnesses to no fault of their own. And so you kind of need a system that is going to provide some support and stability, you know, if that is part of what your life is. I also say people make mistakes. And if you're a middle class or an upper middle class person and you make mistakes, well, you can come out of that and you'd be okay. But if you're in poverty and you make mistakes, that could be the difference between being able to eat for a few days or not eat for a few days, or being able to put a roof over your head. So for me, in terms of the people who work, the evidence simply doesn't show it. And I think that the design of any program, I think, is also going to help sort of ensure that, you know, people have not only the right incentives, but also I think you want a basic income program that provides that stability for people who may not be able to work for any number of reasons. In terms of costing too much, I'm starting to chuckle a little bit about this. And if you want the truth, I think ultimately this will not be the thing that's going to stop us, at least I think in Canada. I think for a few reasons. One is because I think we know that when you know you already have an outdated system, when you already know that you have a system that's actually not providing the supports that you need right now, what's the cost of us actually not doing anything? I think we also have great examples in Canada, and it's not just healthcare, but it's also our pensions and our old age security for seniors, where initially it's always thinking like, how are we going to put in universal healthcare? I can assure you there were a lot of people who thought that that was an impossible thing for us to do, you know, at that time, and it was a huge cost. But you had a very brave man by the name of Tommy Douglas, who was seeing people after the Depression and after World War II ended on the streets and saying, why are these people not taken care of? And he had the vision to be able to say they need to have access to basic health care. And once he was able to prove it in one province, then it was something that we adopted in provinces, right across Canada. So I actually would say to you, and maybe the last point I'm going to make, because Sheila had mentioned it, and I think it's an important point for us to make. I do think we're in a big transition period. So, we're in a digital and, knowledge economy. So for me, I actually see basic income. I think it should be the cornerstone of Canada's economic growth and innovation strategy. If you provide a system that provides a foundation to social welfare system so that people have the stability they need to make the best decisions for themselves, and they're not going to worry about whether to eat or whether they need to put a roof over their head, I think that leads to training and retraining, starting businesses, being entrepreneurs. And so for me, it should be part of any type of, to me, basic income should be part of should be the cornerstone of any type of economic growth and innovation strategy. And maybe I'll just make one more point and then I'll pass the baton over. I'm beginning to think, and this gets to Lee's point around education, I'm beginning to think that really the battle it's changing people's minds and it's educating people. Because in the end, we have the proof around people won't work. We have in terms of cost too much, we also have examples about how massive big new programs have gotten into place. And we do have successes here in Canada. But I think it's really this cultural change about, whether it's privilege or, helping people to understand and change their minds, I think is going to be the key thing that we all have to work on moving forward. Thanks so much, Sheila.
Well, thank you. This is such a rich discussion, and I'm noticing I can't see anything because at my age, I can only do one thing at a time. Multitasking has gone by the wayside. But it looks like there's an incredible chat going on, which is really cool. And Hannah is also starting to send me quite a lot of really interesting audience questions as well. So I'm going to try to quickly finish this round and go to our last round. And some of the last round actually gets at some of the audience questions as well. So is there I think Kim and anybody else who wants to comment on our zombies and sacred cows?
Well, as you know, I sometimes get so frustrated by these questions. I'm calling you and others and Evelyn and saying, what the hell? Why can't people see this? Excuse my language. But so I agree with what Leah and Julie and Stacey have said. And it's part of the reason we put out from our office, and I should have sent you the links, and someone there who's smarter than me can probably find it. We did a perspectives document because I wanted my colleagues to understand what we were talking about. We weren't talking about checks for billionaires. We weren't talking about gutting all assistance programs. We weren't talking about, doing things that are going to cost gazillions of dollars and tell people to stay home. We weren't doing any of that. And so we put out a perspectives document. But one of the things that I want to pick up on that both Julie and Leah said, in Canada in particular, I think it's no accident that many of us who are working on this understand at a visceral level. Many of us grew up working class, if not in social, with families on social assistance. It's something we know in our bones. And even if we, like me, have transitioned class because of incredible privilege of education and now this job, the root of it. I can't tell you how many colleagues, and just recently because of a speech I made, a whole bunch of them said, "That's it, you're calling me a white wealthy man." And I'm going, "Well, you are." and I suddenly realized, like, some of them really can't get it. And there was a really brave doctor during this pandemic who actually said how ashamed he was, or he didn't say, he uses those exact words, but talked about in the shadow of our parliament, in the shadow of Parliament Hill, there were people living in homeless shelters during this pandemic, working full time at minimum wage jobs, and particularly in personal care workers, and couldn't afford to rent a place. Now, that was news to many of my colleagues. 90% of the communities in Canada, people working full time at minimum wage jobs cannot afford to rent a one-bedroom apartment. The fact that that's news is part of why we need to continue to challenge. The fact that if you borrow money in any province or territory in our country and you're on social assistance, it gets counted as income was news to my colleagues. Now, when I said, imagine if every loan you ever took, every mortgage you ever took, every investment you made where you borrowed money to do it, that was counted as income and you were taxed accordingly. How quickly do you think that policy would change in our country? And so the fact that we have the stigma that attaches to poverty, the stigma that attaches to people with mental health issues, addiction issues, past trauma, is also part of the issue, because they're not likely to be the ones to step up and raise these issues because they're struggling every day and just trying to manage in that world. And so I think we have a responsibility also to make our colleagues feel a little uncomfortable about the level of privilege that we all have, so that they know and understand a bit of these issues. Because when they say, just recently, one of my colleagues was arguing for a bereavement. There's a private member's bill around getting bereavement leave. Everybody think, during this pandemic, all of us have lost people who have died. And so, well, I shouldn't say all of us, but many of us have lost people. And you understand why you want bereavement leave. Well, guaranteed livable income would give you that. You wouldn't have to make excuses for why you needed time off, whether it's to care for people or to grieve them. Similarly, sick leave has been a big issue. And yet we haven't made it to that next step. And I think we have to keep making those links for folks who aren't able to make them for themselves, because it is so far from their lived reality. And I think that's part of it. But I certainly want to hear from others who've been doing it about how else you do it. I think the issue of kids leaving care, there's so many people, but there are also the individuals who are not necessarily valued as the vote getters. And I think we have to change some of that attitude and challenge those attitudes in the way that, we've seen during this pandemic, an understanding from many more people about how precarious income is, even for the middle class. And so my experience is it's not the people, the general public, who don't get it. It's the politicians and the people in incredibly privileged positions who have some of the decision-making power who we have to convince. Because if they had any one iota of those experiences, they could tap into it in much the way all of you, me, Hugh Siegel, and others have. And so I think we have to keep challenging and quite frankly, making it a bit uncomfortable for them to continue to pretend that everybody can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And as Hugh has said, when increasingly people don't even have boots.
Thanks, Kim. Liam, you look like you're ready.
Yes, I'll just be very quick. I know you want to get onto the audience, so I'll be very fast, but and to the third part here. But I'm just going to say, I think everything that everyone has said, that the points are right on in terms of what some of the concerns are versus what the realities on the ground are. And so from the only thing I would add from our vantage point, in the last 6 months, we've done over 200 direct briefings and or meetings with members of Congress and staff on both sides of the aisle about even 50-50 Democrats and Republicans. These concerns that you listed, particularly work, cost, details matter, and it's too radical. Those are the top 4. You named them exactly right, Sheila. We hear those all the time. And I think that the most effective counter to all of those things that we've started to see open the doors is that we just bring both the anecdotal evidence and stories as well as the numbers from the ground, and we share that in an educational, concrete format in a way that's helpful to members of Congress and their staffs. And we see a big difference, right? And you know, those elected members who are on this call right now know how busy being an elected official is, right? I'm glad I'm not one, right? You're constantly inundated with things. You have people coming at you. You have people, all different people want things from you. And so to the extent that organizations like ours can serve as a conduit for useful, concrete, helpful information, that doesn't mean you're going to win everyone over, but it does mean that you can transmit a very easy message in a way that helps members of Congress start to rally around this kind of a vision. One example of that was a member of Congress in Ohio, who I won't say who it was, but whose position on direct stimulus checks flipped as a result of a story from one of our members, who is a 35-year-old woman who her $600 stimulus check enabled her to get her car fixed. Her car was broken. She didn't have the money to get it repaired. She got it repaired. Then she was able to commute to a job, and she actually went back to work as a result. Just that one interaction with that one constituent to this particular member of Congress actually flipped their position on further stimulus payments, and we were actually able to get a bipartisan bill introduced as a result of their work. So just bringing those stories to the key decision makers has been really, really effective.
Great. Giselle, do you want to weigh in on this question, or do you want to wait for the next one? Because I have 2 from the audience specifically for you. Okay.
I just want to quickly say, play the devil's advocate here and point out that we are living on ideas that were developed during the Enlightenment and based on self-interest. And I think that part of our message, which I have not heard in this panel thus far, is making the case that UBI will save capitalism. UBI will make people into consumers without whom you can't make money. So, you know, there are 2 sides to everything. There are many, and the people who would listen to that are actually in control. So it's kind of important that we fashion a message that appeals to them. Because if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government, right? So that's all I wanted to say.
That's amazing. I also see it looks like we just broke the chat box. Like it says 99 plus now. It's like, oh my God, what have you done to us? So that's kind of cool. It means there's an awful lot of interest in this. So my last question is actually, we've been leading into this, is really like what things look like going forward. So specifically about the role of champions, you know, like it takes a certain amount of courage and determination and whatever to not just be a supporter of this issue, but because there are a lot of them, but to be a champion. So maybe if you want to share maybe a little bit about sort of what made you a champion, and then what is the role of champions now? How do we get more of them? What are the synergies between the movement and political people that we can build on? Just bringing more and more people on board. And the specific questions for Giselle, I think, are very related from the audience. So I'm going to put those out now too. And that's, from a strategic perspective, what's the work do you see we need to do in the US over the next year in order to move UBI forward politically? And part two, what things, if any, have you heard at this NABIG Congress that have changed your strategic perspective? So interesting questions. Who wants to tackle this? Stacy, you're looking pensive. What does that
Well, I have something to say, but I would love to hear from the Canadian side and people who are actually in the halls of government trying to do the work, you know, because you guys obviously are amazing champs. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. I think we can talk about how we're trying to build champs from the outside a little bit, but I think with you is a great place to start.
Okay, Julie, you were waving your hand. Was that?
Only because, to be honest, you look like you were looking for someone to talk, and I'm like, sure, I don't mind sort of going up a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about it, although I will tell you, as everybody else sort of adds and contributes, I keep on thinking, oh, there's another two things I want to say. So in terms of this champion question, I'm actually going to start off where Liam kind of left off in terms of the sharing stories. Recently, our national government, our federal Liberal government, introduced national childcare in our budget. The reason we did that is particularly during the pandemic, a lot of men were really experiencing what it's like to be at home and have to work and actually take care of kids. They were sharing stories. So by the time we actually went and had to try to get this over the finish line, and just so you know, this has been another thing that's been 50 years in the making in Canada in terms of us trying to get to national childcare. So, you know, I don't want to give all the accolades only to our government, but it was finally like corporate Canada and your big leaders of our society who actually had to be at home and experience this, that we could actually put something like a national childcare and $30 billion and all this money and allocate to it. So these stories, I think, are really important. Liam, from your end, as someone who's trying to educate, but I'd also say, as someone who, I'm in a working class riding, me sharing those stories with my colleagues really makes a difference, and it resonates with my colleagues. So to me, the sharing of the stories is absolutely vital. The second thing is, and this is me listening in the House as I sort of, you know, was doing second reading for my bill earlier this week. There's some, I would say, some issues that were raised by different political parties, and some of them, to be truthfully, I thought, you know what, my next job, if I'm blessed to sort of come back, whether it's under another re-election or whether we actually come back and continue to govern in the fall, is for me to actually really address the key issues that they are raising. So to me, I don't want to ignore it. It's like there were some legitimate things, and I would say each of the parties raised legitimate things. And so for me, I want to tackle legitimately some of the things that they were talking about. Some of it I have to educate, but some of it, there's a couple legitimate things that I thought, let's work on that. I will also say to you, it's like we're moving much faster than ever before. I always say the world of work has changed faster than ever before, but we also need decisions to be made different, like faster than we've done before. It's taking too long to do things. And I would say to you, our systems of government it's the same old system and the old machines. And I think that's one of the key things that I feel that I need to focus a little bit on in terms of really starting a question to say, you guys, we cannot take another 10 years to actually like debate this type of a bill. We need something in place sooner. So I think I need to start asking some of those big questions as well, in terms of, we made some fast decisions through the pandemic. What are maybe some of the new ways that we could start making some of our decisions in a way that still it invites people to input, and it still allows us to be responsible for the dollars that we're actually spending. So I think those are just sort of some of my initial sort of contributions to the discussion on champions.
Thanks, Julie. When you started talking about the dads at home, this image flashed to me of Mayor Melvin Carter on Thursday night with his toddler in the frame. Yeah, it's a very strange phenomenon to think that Zoom has actually humanized us a little bit with us being so far apart. But yeah,
Can I just mention one thing that I forgot? And I'm just seeing Kim's face because she mentioned this, and I said, "Oh, I have to mention this to her." In my area, we call it ridings here in Canada. I have 43% were born in another country. The languages I have is multiple. And so Kim, I would say to you, I have to actually convince the working class in my riding who come from other countries and have different languages also of the benefits of something like a guaranteed basic income. Because the thing they say to me is, you want my hardworking taxpayer dollar to go to keep people at home? Is that what you want me to do? So it's a very big education for me because I'm dealing with multiple languages and people coming from different cultures. So I say to you, yes, it's absolutely the privilege. It's actually absolutely the people who have sort of the education and sort of, who've been around. But I'd also say to you, particularly in places like mine, I'm spending a lot of time also educating those who are working class, but they're of a different mindset, and they see the world transitioning and changing through their kids, because kids are living the new reality of our world of work now. They're seeing it through their kids, but I now need to sort of make that connection about why basic income is going to support their kids and grandkids. And that's the other story that I've now started to go out with as well.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I think I'm going to go to Giselle now to answer the general question or the specific questions for her for an American perspective.
So I'm not involved. The fund is a nonprofit, and I am not involved in any political activities, except for one, which was under the H option, a little known option that's available for think tanks and people who are in the nonprofit world, that allows you to lobby, not to get involved in elections, but lobby. And in that respect, as Liam and Ana Aurelio, who represents who lobbies for the Economic Security Project, as they began to work together with some of the, behind the curtain help from Stacy and the people she had access to in the grassroots, I actually brought in a very old line, well-known, very influential person, the Ben Bonds, who's part of the Ben Bonds group, who's a lobbyist in Washington, who was a protege of Lyndon Johnson and has all of these connections. So to that extent, I think that this is what this represents, in addition to the fact that you need to bring pressure on the political class. It also speaks to the collaboration between four organizations actually, that do their part, right? I mean, it's the division of labor thing. I'm totally in the 18th century today. But the other thing and really the main mission that I took on for the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity when I founded it in 2019 is the marketing of the idea. So, when I did my due diligence, I looked around and I saw all kinds of people being interviewed, writing terrific articles, research papers, academics arguing about the angels dancing on the head of a pin. All of that, there was a tremendous amount of activity, especially as 2019 went on and Andrew's campaign picked up steam. But nobody was selling, by Philip Morris. I mean, no one was selling this idea as a product. And this is essentially what, with my limited resources, I am planning to do for the next year.
Can I piggyback on what a few different people have said here that I think is just really that I would just kind of echo total agreement with. I think there's been conversations about this idea that stories are critical, also some around this idea that we need to, that one thing we've learned through the pandemic is we need to move faster, and that the way legislation gets passed, certainly in the US, I think we would all agree is just incredibly painful and slow. You know, we had almost 8 months between our first two stimulus checks in the United States, because the halls of government basically just ground to a complete halt. So I think that one of the things that and to kind of jump on or support what Giselle was saying about coalition building of multiple organizations, early in 2020, Income Movement, working with Economic Security Project, Humanity Forward, and Fund for Humanity, we pulled together kind of a day of action where we delivered more than 2 million signatures of, from petitions asking for $2,000 a month emergency guaranteed income for families and individuals, to help with recovery from what was happening from COVID. We delivered these petition signatures to senators all across the country. Through the delivery of those, we delivered over 80,000 to a lead senator in Oregon, Senator Ron Wyden, who is chair of the Finance Committee. So incredibly important and influential. When we delivered those, we had a conversation with his team, and we invited Economic Security Project to join us. And immediately we were having not only conversations of stories, we invited people from Oregon to be part of those, business owners, family, parents, students, to talk about what was going on in their lives, the tough decisions they were facing every month to be able to take care of their most basic needs. Alongside that, we started having conversations about what it means to have automatic stabilizers and have things in place so that when situations, economic situations, hit a certain threshold, that there should be automatic stabilizers that kick on, so that we're not, the people are not beholden to legislators getting their act together and passing something. And so historically in the United States, the support around that, certainly on the Democratic side of things, has been around unemployment insurance. When unemployment reaches a certain number, additional money can get kicked in from the federal level. But what happened in that conversation was the beginning of saying, let's actually include monthly regular stimulus checks in the automatic stabilizer component. So whatever that trigger is, it shouldn't just be unemployment, it should be checks going out, because at that point we also recognized that checks had been the most effective money that had gone out. Unemployment insurance was incredibly important, but we also knew and understand from the data that unemployment is deeply problematic. There's all kinds of holes. It's different from one state to the next. It didn't always necessarily get into the hands of people that needed it, and that unemployment wasn't designed for our current system of how, you know, people having to work multiple jobs, et cetera. So that conversation turned into Senator Wyden becoming a champ for this idea of recurring checks being part of automatic stabilizers. He did an open letter to Biden, got 20 other senators to sign, and it's now something that Humanity Forward is doing work on the House side to get bipartisan support for something coming out of that side of the government. So we can see in these really over the last several months, when we all come together, when we're collaborating, when we're thinking strategically together in organizations that are doing very specific work, we can start to have really important impact. And it's really exciting to see that impact, because alone, it would not have been the same. If we had not included a policy advisor in that conversation with Senator Wyden's team, that moment of them feeling deeply empathetic because they're hearing really heartbreaking stories, without that other conversation there to help them say, you have something you can do right now, it would have been certainly way less impactful. It's some of the first questions they asked. Well, what can we do about this? What does this potentially look like? And we had an answer. So I think it's just really fundamental that those kinds of things are happening right now behind the scenes, but that are just so important to building the momentum and getting us kind of closer and closer to some kind of permanent federal legislation. I don't know, Liam, if you want to add into that, because you guys, have been such an important part as well.
Oh, well, thank you, Stacey, for that credit. But I don't want to. I'm happy to chime in, but Sheila, I don't want to take things off of your American Canadian, back and forth here. So
Oh,
Okay, I want to be respectful of the moderator's role here, but absolutely. The role for champions that I see, obviously events like this are incredibly important, where all of us who already believe in the vision are all sitting here together, strategizing, sharing best practices, sharing ideas. That's fantastic. But what I would say, at least from, again, I want to make clear, I can only speak from an American perspective and from an inside the Beltway perspective, where the decision makers are living and where they're, starting to really assess their views and their positions on the idea of a basic income, on the idea of cash relief. From that perspective, there are really two things that I think everyone here can do in each their own way that will actually practically move this ball forward. And because everyone on this call is a champion of this idea. One is I would really encourage everyone, and I think this is something that we've learned over the last 6, 7, 8 months, embrace intermediate steps, right? And why should we embrace intermediate steps in particular? I don't think this applies to every issue, but with this, embrace intermediate steps, because when people, this is a kind of policy that naturally makes the case for itself once implemented, right? I think it was mentioned earlier that we don't need to do more pilots. We just need to start piloting it by implementing it, right? In the States, our best two examples of that are the stimulus payments and the child tax credit, which have already been referenced. That's those policies being implemented, even in the short term, are far better than any advocacy or any case or any data that we could ever present, right? The actual reality of politicians, constituents receiving this and seeing the concrete impact it made in their lives. And if we or any other champions had been absolutists and say, we're not going to work on anything that's not a full basic income, we may not have seen those intermediate steps, and then the broader movement would not be as accelerated or advanced as it is now. So that's number one. And so, for your unique political environment, whether you're working on the local level, the state level, or the federal level in whatever country, those intermediate steps will look different depending on the political dynamics where you are. The second thing that I would say that has been a lesson for me and a lesson for our organization at Humanity Forward is that it is critical to use your expertise. Everyone on this call, all certainly all the panelists here, but many of the attendees, I'm sure, have a huge amount of expertise on this issue. I really encourage you to leverage that expertise, not to talk to other basic income allies, but to talk to the opponents, talk to the people who are not natural supporters, talk to the people who maybe at first blush think this is a crazy idea, because you will find that if you're empathetic and willing to think about the issue from the other person's point of view, you can really make a lot of headway. This is something that would advance so many people and so many different communities. It would help small businesses. It would help veterans. It would help teachers. It would help rural areas. It would help big cities. And so if you can customize your case a little bit to the person, you can really have a much stronger sense of efficacy with your goal, because then you can lock arms with a person that might be a very unlikely partner. We've done this in a number of instances, and it's been incredibly effective for us. When we're able to lock arms with someone that a member of Congress would never think would support this issue, and we walk into their office together and we say, hey, we both support this idea. Here's how we think you can work on it. The results are much, much better. So those are the two biggest lessons for me of the last 6 months is embrace intermediate steps and speak to unlikely partners. Sheila, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Leah, I am on. Yes. Leah, is there anything else you want to add? Because I know there are some resistors that you have really pulled in recently, and I think and have become champions in a way. So can you talk a little bit more about, again, pulling all of this together to make a bigger movement?
Sure. Well, I'm going to talk about a story, and it's called the myth of meritocracy, that somehow if we all just work really hard and do the right things, that we'll all advance. And that's a lie. That's a bold-faced lie. In fact, capitalist systems are designed to do exactly the opposite. They are designed to keep people out. I think people were behind before the pandemic. We knew that. Everybody was so shocked about what happened in long-term care. We've known about the conditions in long-term care forever. We knew seniors were living in poverty. One only has to look on the streets to know that people are really struggling. and unsheltered. We knew all of this. We are at a critical juncture. We are in a climate emergency. People are getting poor. People who work jobs in, for example, traditional fossil fuel industries, that industry is starting to implode and gut. In the oil industry, for example, in Canada, often the oil is worth less than the barrel that it's being held in at certain parts during the pandemic. And so every decision we make right now, particularly coming out of the pandemic, matters. And I think more and more people are understanding that. I think, one of the gifts that was given in the pandemic is that we really were able to see the real inequality that has always been there. And now we have an actual choice to do something about it. We actually have a choice. The only thing the pandemic did is highlight inequalities and inequities that were always there that we choose to ignore. And then we found ourselves in a pandemic and it was dire, and things like washing your hands, social distancing is only possible. We realized that if you have a home, if you have access to clean drinking water, and the fact that we failed to care for people put everybody at risk, that if we don't all care for everybody in the circle, it hurts everybody. And I just want to mention what artists gutted during the pandemic. And I don't know about you, but if I didn't have movies, books, films during the pandemic, I would have died. My spirit would have died. Art kept me alive. Art, something that is not valued in capitalist systems. Care work, particularly most often done by women, caring for children, for example, caring for elderly relatives, for example. These are things that are not valued, and workers, particularly temporary foreign and migrant workers who were forced to work in conditions where they were given in Canada, in food packing plants, food rations, living in conditions, in cramped headquarters, in closed quarters the size of a locker. That was a breeding ground for the pandemic. So it shone a light on that. We're at a critical juncture. Putting in a guaranteed income, it's a way to even push forward a brand new economy, moving into a green economy, giving people choice, actual choice, and actually valuing kinds of work that have never been valued or even deemed as work. One of the hardest jobs I had in my life was being a parent. That was my hardest job. It's even harder than being an MP, yet it was not valued. So, I think the movement is there. And I think it's about listening to the pulse on the ground as an elected official and lifting up voices that are already there. You just have to look at the polls and you have to listen. So I'm going to end off with a funny story. So when I was in university, I had a professor, and I think he was a professor, and this was when I was going to university. I think he taught in an elementary school for a long time. He was an early childhood educator. And every time we were talking in class, in university class, our professor, he'd say, "Open your listening ears." He would always say that. And we called him Mr. Listening Ears. Anyway, I think people are speaking, and we just have to listen. If you look at the movement you're part of, Sheila, there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of people part of guaranteed income in Canada, the movement. That's all I've done. So I think the movement is doing their job. It's up to people that are in positions of privilege and power to actually listen. So I would say keep pushing, keep doing what you're doing, because it's working. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. I am mindful of time, and I'm wondering if I can go into a quick sort of lightning round where I put out 3 audience questions. One I particularly want Kim to answer, I think, and I may add a little bit to it. Is that okay? We'll just do these really 3 quick questions. Okay, so let me go. wonderful people, Megan and Hannah in the background, are all helping me do this magic here. Okay, so really quick, which research institutes should we, so you can answer any of these, anybody wants. Which research institute should we follow? Somebody attended a workshop with a bunch of smart activist women, and they were talking about basic income from a variety of perspectives. They concluded that they were skeptical because of fears around hypothetical unintended consequences that come up from people. And now the question specifically for Canada, saying the difficulty in Canada is that all the organizations that support basic income have been working on it for so long that they each have their own version of basic income and are quite divided. I don't know, I might add my own twist to that. I think there are a lot of versions out there. I don't think they're all coming from the movement that I think is fairly cohesive. I think we're getting people talking about unintended consequences or coming up with their own versions. For a while in Canada, when COVID hit, everybody jumped into this and everybody wanted to name it something else, so that it was almost like name the baby animal at the zoo kind of contest, that everybody had a different version. So people hear about lots of versions, but I don't think those are necessarily coming from a divided movement. Anyway, anybody want to comment on any of those in a lightning round where we've got like maybe 10 minutes if we're pushing it?
Well, seeing as you said my name, Sheila, I'll start. I think that we do need to pull together and figure out, I thought it was interesting, Giselle's comments. For sure, in Canada, we know that the child benefit, every dollar that goes into it generates $2 of economic development. That's because poor people spend their money where they have it, in their communities. And that's not true of wealthy people, and the divide has been shown. I think it's also true as, when Julie said, trying to convince, predominantly it's working class men. I often say, if I can convince my dad of something, then I know we've, and on this, it really just takes opening up the first couple of layers, and I think then people get it. As Leah said, I think the myths of meritocracy we have to keep exposing, and I think we do. A call out and shout out to Jesse Gollum and all of the folks who've created Humans of Basic Income, all the stories that are out there. I do think part of it is coming together as coalitions and working together to push that this is the way we need to go, whether it's because it feeds the sustainable development goals, whether it's because it helps us come out with more than just GDP as a measure of how we're going to emerge from this pandemic. And I think talking to, as Leah has done, as Julia has done, as you're all doing, and I hope that actually we can, instead of saying, let's come with a certain pilot in mind or a certain approach or a certain initiative in mind, it is really pushing those stories, because right now I'm still surprised at how few people know how many people have still been left behind during this pandemic. And as Leah said, and Julia, as you all know, we all know those inequities pre-existed this pandemic, but the fact that some people aren't moving, and that it in my humble opinion, it tends to be those who have had some ideas for some time about how we should move, that we end up with things like what happened here in British Columbia. So British Columbia said they wanted to look at guaranteed livable income, and then they hire a bunch of people who are, the male, pale, stale economists who come up with, basically say, yes, we should do this, but not right now, and only for these people. Well, I think we just have to start pushing and doing it. And so, I know sometimes it makes you less popular, and people weren't happy when just before the holidays in December, I decided not to vote and to try and amend the government budget bill. But those are some of the measures I think we have to keep reminding people why this is important.
You're muted, Sheila.
Yes, I'm doing my version of, the family thing. I have a puppy in the background who just woke up. So, but his timing was pretty good. Okay, who wants to run next?
Sheila, I unfortunately have to go. So it's exactly what Liam said. We are like on the run. I've already done 2 events. I have 2 more today. And so I have a speech literally in 15 minutes where there's a podium waiting for me. So I'm so sorry. This has been really, really excellent. I'll have one more ad and then just say thank you. I would love, probably more in the fall, I would love a roundtable of all the politicians that are actively working on this. So put in pilots, put in legislation, introduce motions. I would love a roundtable on that. That would be really helpful to me, because then we start talking tactics, what works, what doesn't work, that kind of stuff. So if I had to talk about how do we move the bar forward, that would be something I would love to see and participate in. But with that, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone participating in this North American Basic Income Guaranteed Conference. It means a lot to me to have been be part of this August panel, as was said earlier. Thanks so much for Sheila for being such a great moderator, and to all the participants for participating. I learned a lot, and I really, really feel that this is just a matter of time before we get this over to the other side in both of our respective countries. So anyways, thank you so much, and please have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Julie. Okay, last comments, lightning round. Anyone else? What about the unintended consequences question? That people are really worried about that. It's something that people did worry about when they went into the Ontario pilot. Are you hearing that? People think, yeah, it's a good idea, but a little too good to be true, and what if kinds of things.
What if people are happy and can support themselves? Yeah, what a terrible unintended consequence. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Giselle.
So I agree with you, Kim, on that. Like, I don't even focus on it. I mean, there's always we still have people that are totally against people getting social assistance still in this country. We have, governments, provincial governments trying to gut healthcare in the country. I mean, I think we're always going to have that, but you can only work with what you have. And I think the movement is there. It is solid, and we just have to keep building on it. I mean, like, there are how many people in the Guaranteed Income Network, the one you lead, Sheila? Like, there's like over 40,000 people. That's huge. That's huge. And it's across the country. I think we just have to keep building the movement, keep building the movement. And eventually, even if it's not this election, eventually it will become a make or break election issue. I'm hoping it is this election.
I would add, or maybe kind of complicate it just a little bit, just knowing at least how things are happening in the United States. It's not going to be a universal basic income that first passes. And I think unintended consequences are a reality for a lot of what's been passed by our government historically. And so especially when it comes to like programs for the poor. So what I would say is, I think part of our mission at Income Movement is not just about elevating stories in key moments, but actually to help put people on the ground at the heart of the design of policy. Because when you have people on the ground who are actually experiencing these things, you are going to better understand what the consequences of existing programs look like, what the reality on the ground is around limitations of access, how you want to distribute it. All kinds of things actually are pretty critical. And we've heard from a couple of different people that are working specifically in the space of protecting women in abusive relationships and things like that, and that distribution and ways you make contact and the ways that you actually distribute money is pretty critical to whether or not you address the problem that you're trying to solve, or you actually create bigger problems for the most marginalized people. So I would just say that I agree. If we could, with a wand, say universal basic income, the unintended consequences piece kind of falls apart. And I think I'm taking the unintended consequences from the more maybe progressive side of, yes, there's going to most likely be unintended consequences if we don't do it right, if we don't really put people at the center of the design of the policy. And much as we see with the Black Lives Matter movement, when you put, you know, and the focus and recognition that if you're focusing on Black trans women and you do things that are going to support them, you're supporting all. I think taking a look and talking to and bringing forward the voices of our most marginalized communities, the people who have been pushed and to the sides and not given a voice, when you invite them in to start thinking about what this policy looks like, you know you're going to support them and you're going to support everybody else in between. So I think that's just an important additional piece that that we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about this coordination across kind of the movement.
Again, puppy in the background. So last word will be to the Americans then, because we've run out of time. So Giselle, do you want, and Liam, do you want to make final comments? Giselle?
I just wanted to pick up on something that was in the chat room, that nobody, you know, Social Security, the Trump tax cuts and Medicare, nobody was worried about unintended consequences. So what we have to do is figure out how those things got passed and, you know, use from lessons learned. I mean, Social Security was a huge thing. And it was, you know, pushed forward by the Townsend clubs, which was one guy who started a bunch of clubs all over the country that at that time had 2 million members who vote to their congressman in 1933.
Okay, Liam.
Okay, I'll be fast. Yeah, my picking up on the comment that Stacy made about speaking to some of the other less used cases or arguments for basic income. I think, you know, Stacy touched on domestic violence as one example that I think doesn't get talked about enough. And that goes to a larger point that I'll make my last word, which is I think that the reason that we're seeing momentum on both sides of the border, on both sides of the US-Canadian border, and frankly, on both sides of the political spectrum, is that we and others are having success sort of jumping past the hurdle of the policy argument and going to the kind of community or the kind of country that the person you're speaking with wants to create. What I mean by that is if you start the conversation, we found, if we start the conversation, whether it's with a group, with a member of Congress, with an individual, with a donor, whoever it might be, and we're talking about, hey, we want to create a universal basic income, here's why this is the best idea. That's not always the best way to go, right? Starting out with, here's the policy and here's why we're right? That's not the most effective approach, because they might have certain mental hurdles to whether or not that is a workable idea. Instead, what's best is to connect with the kind of community or the kind of country the person you're talking to wants to create. Do you want a country, at least in America, do you want a country in America where small towns that have been in decline for the last 40 years see a revival? Is that something that we have common ground on? Do you want to see a situation where suicides and drug overdoses that have been on the rise for the last 4 years straight, where we start to actually tackle that, we start to turn that down? And so once you can find common ground on an outcome that you want, make it outcome oriented, not policy oriented, then you can work backwards from the outcome to the policy. And we found that approach to be something that's allowed us to talk to far more people than I think we ever could have expected, and see interest in this kind of an issue from a much broader spectrum than one traditionally might think. So I just encourage each of you to do that in your own ways. And I'll say, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's such an exciting time to be working on this issue. And it would not be the same without people both across the country and across the world who are sharing in this mission. So really, really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you all very, very much, including for staying a little bit over time. I hope we will all now go forth and get out of our own bubbles and on to the next session, which I believe starts at 5 o'clock Eastern time. Stacy, is that correct?
That's the next keynote, but there's sessions in between right now. There's some breakouts.
So sessions in between the next keynote, where some of the issues that we've been talking about now about coordination and